buckle up, because today we're time traveling back to the early 1900s.
Oh, wow.
To a world on the brink of major change.
Sounds intriguing.
We're diving into the Russo-Japanese War, but with a twist.
Okay, I'm intrigued. A twist how?
We're asking, what if this war never happened? How would the 20th century have unfolded differently?
Now, that's a question that'll really get you thinking.
We're talking about a clash between titans. Russia, a global superpower hungry for expansion. And Japan, a rising nation determined to make its mark on the world stage.
Two very different nations, each with their own ambitions.
And caught in the middle of it all. Korea and Manchuria both vying for control and influence in East Asia.
It was a powder keg waiting to explode.
Exactly. And we're going to break down how this conflict reshaped the geopolitical landscape.
It's a story of ambition, miscalculation, and the often unforeseen consequences of war.
We've got a mountain of research here, examining the war's causes, the key players, the outcomes, the whole shebang.
I'm eager to dig into it.
But the real aha moment for me is how this relatively short war had such a massive ripple effect on the entire world.
It's a classic example of how history is never linear. One event can set off a chain reaction that reverberates for generations.
It's like a historical domino effect. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, the world is a completely different place.
Yeah, and the motivations of the key players in this drama are crucial to understanding the war's impact.
Absolutely. You can't tell the story without talking about Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, driven by a desire to expand his empire. And facing mounting pressure back home.
He was a man trying to juggle multiple crises, both domestic and international.
And then on the other side, you have Japanese Prime Minister Hirohito,
representing a nation eager to prove its strength on the world stage.
Ito and the Meiji government were determined to show that Japan was a force to be reckoned with.
They had modernized their military and their economy, and they were ready to challenge the established order.
Two powerful figures, each with their own vision for the future. And it's fascinating to see how their paths collide in this conflict.
It's a clash of ideologies, of ambition, and of two nations vying for dominance in a rapidly changing world.
What really struck me from these sources is that this war, this clash of titans, it wasn't inevitable. There were missed opportunities for diplomacy, moments where things could have gone differently.
Absolutely, and the sources highlight several of these pivotal moments where a different decision, a different approach could have potentially averted the conflict.
It makes you wonder, what if they had chosen a different path?
It's a question that historians continue to debate.
But one thing is for sure, the decisions made in those crucial moments had a lasting impact on the course of history.
That they did.
Take 1898, for example. Russia takes control of Port Arthur from China, a strategic move that directly threatened Japan's interests in the region.
That was a major turning point. It sent a clear signal of Russia's ambitions in East Asia.
It was a bold move, one that would have serious repercussions.
It was like Russia walked right up to Japan and said, "We're here to stay."
Exactly.
Japan took notice. They weren't going to just sit back and watch Russia encroach on their sphere of influence.
You'd think that this would be the moment where tensions boil over and war breaks out.
It would have been understandable given the circumstances, but Japan, surprisingly, opted for a more diplomatic approach.
They did. They didn't immediately jump into a fight.
Not at first. In 1903, they actually proposed a deal to Russia.
Oh, really? What did they offer?
They were willing to recognize Russia's sphere of influence in Manchuria
Okay.
in exchange for Russia recognizing Japan's influence in Korea.
So, a compromise.
Exactly. A chance to avoid a costly and destructive war.
Sounds like a pretty good deal to me. What happened? Why didn't this prevent the war?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, the answer lies in a series of miscalculations and missed opportunities.
Russia messed it up, huh?
Let's just say they didn't exactly seize the opportunity for peace.
It's incredible how quickly things can escalate, how easily diplomacy can falter.
And in this case, that faltering had profound consequences, not just for Russia and Japan, but for the entire world.
Yeah.
They hesitated, stalled, and ultimately just didn't see the value in a compromise.
What a blunder. I mean, hindsight is 20/20, right?
Yeah.
But you have to wonder what they were thinking.
It's easy to judge in hindsight.
Yeah.
But at the time, Russia saw themselves as this superior power.
Oh, absolutely.
They underestimated Japan's determination and military capabilities.
Pride before the fall, as they say.
Exactly.
And that brings us to 1904, the year everything changes.
The year the world is shocked.
Japan, in a move that surprised pretty much everyone, launches a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur.
It was a gamble, a huge risk.
Yeah.
but one that paid off spectacularly.
I mean, talk about a bold move. They were facing a massive empire, a global superpower.
Right. Everyone thought Russia would crush them.
So how did they pull it off?
Japan had been preparing for this moment for years.
They were ready to rumble.
They had studied Russian military tactics, they had modernized their navy and army, and they had a clear strategy in place.
They weren't messing around.
Not at all.
They were playing 3D chess while Russia was still stuck on checkers.
That's a great way to put it.
So they weren't just lucky, they had a plan.
Oh, absolutely not. This was a calculated move, executed with precision.
And the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 really solidified their victory.
Oh, that was a decisive victory, no doubt. A crushing defeat for the Russian Navy.
The world was stunned. No one could believe that Japan, a nation many in the West still saw as inferior, had pulled it off.
It really shook things up in the halls of power. Suddenly, the established order didn't seem so established anymore.
It's a moment that really highlights the changing dynamics of the early 20th century. This wasn't just about two countries fighting over territory. It was about something bigger, something deeper.
Oh, absolutely. This was about ideology, about recognition, about challenging the very foundations of global power.
For Japan, this war was about proving themselves on the world stage. It was about saying, hey, we're a modern, powerful nation, and we deserve a seat at the table.
Exactly. They were tired of being underestimated, of being seen as a second-tier power.
They were making a statement, and the whole world was watching.
And let's not forget about Russia.
What was their angle in all of this?
On the surface, it was about expanding their empire, securing their interests in East Asia.
You know, the usual imperial ambitions.
Right. But if we dig a little deeper, we see a regime grappling with internal struggles, with social unrest, with a growing sense of dissatisfaction among the Russian people.
They were trying to flex their muscles abroad to distract from the problems at home.
Exactly. It's a tale as old as time. When things aren't going so well internally, create an external enemy to rally against.
The classic wag the dog strategy.
Precisely.
And caught in the middle of this power struggle was Korea.
Ah, Korea. A nation with its own rich history and culture.
And unfortunately, a nation that often found itself at the mercy of its more powerful neighbors.
That's sadly the case for many nations throughout history, isn't it? Caught in the crossfire, their fate decided by forces beyond their control.
Absolutely. And the sources really paint a heartbreaking picture of how Korea suffered during this conflict.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of war, of how ambitions and ideologies can have devastating consequences for everyday people.
And it didn't end with the war, did it? This was just the beginning of a long and difficult period for Korea.
Sadly, you're right. The war paved the way for Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910, which led to decades of harsh rule and oppression.
It's a tragic chapter in Korean history, one that continues to cast a shadow on the region today.
It's a reminder that the decisions made in those halls of power, the battles fought on distant battlefields, they have ripple effects that can last for generations. It's important to remember that this wasn't just a regional conflict. The Russo-Japanese War had global implications.
Oh, absolutely. This was a watershed moment in history. It shifted the balance of power and forced the world to rethink its assumptions about the East and the West.
It's exactly. Before the war, many in the West still clung to this outdated view of Asia as backwards and inferior.
Right. They underestimated Japan's capabilities and their determination.
And they paid the price for it.
Big time. The world was stunned by Japan's victory.
It was a wake-up call. It showed that the old order, with Europe at the center, was crumbling.
And it signaled the rise of new global players.
Japan's victory inspired nationalist movements in colonized countries around the world. It gave them hope that they too could break free from imperial rule.
It's amazing to think about the ripple effects of this one conflict.
It's a testament to how interconnected the world really is.
And how even events that seem far away can have a profound impact on our lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of impact, let's circle back to Russia for a moment.
Okay, because we left them in a pretty precarious position after their defeat.
To say the least, this wasn't just a military defeat for Russia, it was a blow to their national pride. It exposed the weaknesses of the Tsarist regime.
They were reeling from the loss.
And the Russian people were fed up. They were tired of poverty, of inequality, of the Tsar's autocratic rule.
So the war was like throwing gasoline on an already smoldering fire.
Precisely. The defeat served as a catalyst for the 1905 revolution.
Which, if I remember correctly, was a pretty tumultuous period in Russian history.
That's an understatement. It was a time of mass protests, strikes, and uprisings.
The people were demanding change.
They wanted better working conditions, more political freedom, a say in their own governance.
And did they get it?
To some extent, yes. The Tsar was forced to make concessions.
Like what?
he agreed to the establishment of the Duma, a legislative body meant to give the Russian people a voice in government.
So a step towards democracy.
In theory, yes, but in reality, the Tsar still held a great deal of power.
So it wasn't a complete victory for the revolutionaries.
No, but it was a start. It showed that change was possible. And it planted the seeds for future revolutions.
Because, of course, this was just the beginning.
Right. The 1905 revolution was just a prelude to the even more dramatic events of 1917.
When the Bolsheviks seized power and established the Soviet Union.
Exactly. The Russo-Japanese War might have ended in 1905, but its consequences continued to shape Russia for decades to come.
It's fascinating how one event can have such far-reaching effects.
Isn't it? It really makes you think about the nature of history, about how seemingly isolated events can set in motion forces that change the course of entire nations.
And about how the decisions made by a handful of powerful individuals can have a ripple effect that impacts millions of lives.
Exactly. And that brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it?
The big one.
What if?
What if the Russo-Japanese War had never happened? How would the 20th century have unfolded differently?
Now that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It's a question that historians have been debating for over a century.
And one that we could speculate about for hours.
But I think what's important to remember is that history is not inevitable.
Right. It's not some predetermined path.
It's a series of choices and consequences.
And those choices matter.
They shape the world we live in.
And they remind us that we have a responsibility to learn from the past, to understand the forces that have brought us to this point.
So we can make more informed decisions about the future.
Exactly, because while history may not repeat itself, it often rhymes.
Well said, well said. This deep dive into the Russo-Japanese War has been, it's been quite a journey.
To say the least.
It's amazing to see how this one conflict, this relatively short war, had such a profound impact on the world.
It really was a turning point in history.
And it's a story that's still relevant today. As we grapple with similar issues of power, ambition, and the unintended consequences of conflict.
Absolutely. The past is never truly past, is it?
No, it's always with us, shaping our present and our future. So as you continue to explore this fascinating period in history, I encourage you to ask yourself, what if? What if things had gone differently? And what lessons can we learn from the past to create a better future? That's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.